I'm Glynn and I work for the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce a new learning resource called Ireland 1900 to 1925, Crisis, War and Revolution, which will be launched online in May. And already speaking there, Dr. Timothy Bowman from the University of Kent will give a flavour of the various sources on one topic, recruitment during the First World War. But I'd like to make a few general points first. So what is the resource? The years 1900 to 1925 encompass some of the most significant events in Ireland's modern history, from the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill to the First World War, Easter Rising, partition of Ireland, and creation of two new states. To mark this series of centenaries, PRONI has partnered with the University of Kent, supported by the History Teachers Association of Northern Ireland, to produce a resource centred on contemporary documents from the PRONI archive. The resource provides accounts from a range of sources and perspectives and is tailored to support A-level study, but will be of interest to anyone exploring this period in our history. The resource is divided into 4 parts, as you can see on the slide. Part 1, the Third Home Rule Crisis, 1910 to 1914. Part 2, the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Part 3, Revolution and Partition, 1918 to 1925. And the final part provides sample A-level questions and answers. The images displayed here from the front cover of the resource and represent certain steps leading up to partition and the creation of the Northern Ireland state. At the top in the middle, you can see the front cover of the programme for the Ulster demonstration against Home Rule held at the Ulster Hall in September 1912. On the bottom left is a photograph of members of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1914, where the image depicts both male and female personnel. At the top on the right is a photograph of Countess Markievicz in 1915, dressed in a military uniform. Con was second in command at St Stephen's Green, Dublin during Easter 1916. In the middle of the bottom row, you can see the front cover of a programme Stephen Scarth showcased this morning, which relates to the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament on the 22nd of June 1921. In his message, the King conveyed that this is a great and critical occasion in the history of the 6 counties, but not for the 6 counties alone, for everything which interests them touch Ireland, and everything touches Ireland finds an echo in the remotest parts of the empire. At top left, you can see an English translation of the Constitution of the Free State of Ireland of 1922, found in the records of the Cabinet's Secretariat. And finally, bottom right is a letter from Michael Collins to a Major Mountry of Favour Royal, County Tyrone, where Collins writes, "I am sure that your actions will be directed towards removing the bigotry that unhappily exists, this doing your individual part in bringing nearer the unity of Ireland." So how can you use and apply this resource in the future? So this resource reflects the A2 curriculum topic, Partition of Ireland, 1900 to 1925, and supports study for the A2 paper on historical investigations and interpretations. 30 primary sources were selected predominantly from the PRONI archive to provide an account of the period where the voice of each tradition can be heard. This resource encourages learning where original records are kept at the heart of historical interpretation. And teachers can select primary sources around a particular theme, event, or activity, such as the Easter Rising, that deepen our understanding. The primary source material offers a unique opportunity to explore narratives and perspectives at a more local and personal level, supporting the wider narrative expressed by historians and in standard textbooks. Students can examine language used, consider context, and identify the different perceptions and interpretations. Everyone can use the resource to develop advanced study skills that help them prepare for third level education. And with its emphasis on using primary source material, Ireland 1900 to 1925 offers an inclusive approach to history, where many differing voices have a place. So I'll hand over now to one of the authors, Dr. Timothy Bowman from the University of Kent, who will explore the case study, drawing out some of the emphasis from the primary sources themselves.
Great, thanks very much for that, Glynn. A great pleasure to be with everyone today, and thanks to the Community Relations Council for organising things. It's been a week where I've been screaming into my computer screen on Teams teaching students, so apologies if I seem to be in that mode today. What I've been working on recently, as well as the pack itself, is a book with two colleagues, William Butler, now at the National Archives, and Michael Wheatley, on a book entitled The Spurious Sacrifice, Irish Recruitment to the British Armed Forces, 1914-18. So when I was asked to speak today, I thought that a topic looking at Irish recruitment to the British Army in 1914 would be quite a useful exercise for us to look at. We have a good range of sources on this in the pack, and it is something that involves all communities in Ireland. There's a large Irish nationalist tradition that developed of recruitment into the British Army in 1914 and 15. It doesn't last much beyond that for reasons that I'll go into shortly, and that there's also an important narrative to be wary of, and one that we would still see in wall murals, particularly in East Belfast and so on, which suggests that only Ulster Protestants enlist in the British Army in the First World War. That's a very pervasive view of popular history that is out there, and despite work that's been done by academic historians for about 30 plus years now, to show that actually recruitment is much wider than that, that is still a popular myth that very much persists. If I come to the next slide, please, to look at Carrick-Fergus matters, please. Yes, great. First two sources, I have three sources first to look at here, and I'll say a little bit about each of them. Two are from newspapers. This one is from the Carrick-Fergus Advertiser, now defunct local newspaper, which was in publication until about 3 or 4 years ago from memory. And this shows you one of a large number of local recruiting meetings that were held, which was to enrol men from the Ulster Volunteer Force into the 36th Ulster Division. Now, Britain is, of course, at war with Germany from the 4th of August 1914. The fact that this is all happening on the 18th of September tells us something, which is that we've had all the negotiations about the Home Rule settlement carried out between the British government and the Irish political parties. That what has passed into law is that Home Rule, of course, a form of devolved government, is on the statute book, but with a suspensory clause that says that it won't come into operation until the end of the war, when various special conditions will be met for Ulster. It's left rather vague, and rather vague for a reason. So that's why we sort of have a time delay. There are examples of members of the Ulster Volunteer Force reporting for duty as Army Reservists on the 5th and 6th of August. So you have quite a contingent has gone already by that stage. And then we turn to these localised recruiting meetings. I have a map and a slide later on that I'll talk about a little more then. But there are about 30 of these local Ulster Volunteer Force meetings throughout the 9 counties of the historic province of Ulster. The biggest contingents that are brought in, as you might expect, are from Belfast, then into more of the rural towns and so on. This one is quite interesting because the man who's running the show in this, Major Mclaughlin MP, he is able to address the members of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Carrickfergus as their commanding officer of the UVF battalion, as the commanding officer designate of the 12th Royal Irish Rifles, and as the local MP. So he carries an enormous amount of weight, and this is a stronger position than any nationalist politician can do in addressing potential recruits, in that Mclaughlin has pretty senior rank in the army. He's soon to be appointed Lieutenant Colonel, and go on indeed to command a battalion of the Irish Guards. In 1915, Mclaughlin was one of those who had served in the army for a number of years, then retired, entered politics, so is deemed to have significant military rank that can then effectively be reactivated in the context of the war. The recruitment then is, as you'll see here, very localised, so it's being held in National School, the Barn Mills National School, and that's unusual. What happened in peacetime was that men would have been expected to go to a major army barracks or a regimental depot, so they would have been in central Belfast or in Antrim, and to enrol there. But there's a lot of this very localised recruiting, which pre-war you see a little bit of occasionally when regiments go on recruiting marches and stop in local areas for an evening or day and run a recruiting event, but otherwise that's quite unusual. So the war has led to that difference in a very localised approach. You'll get the idea of what goes on with the medical examination, which is an interesting point to take out here too. Quite a lot of the reports of recruiting and the local press that is quite good at covering them. It's not just the Carrickfergus Advertiser. You see this in all sorts of things, in Partial Reporter, and Fermanagh, the Spectator, and Bangor, and so on. And a lot of them make this point about the medical examinations and that very few men have been rejected. Now, that's not unimportant because at the time of the South African War, when recruits had come forward, that was shown just how bad the living conditions were of a lot of the working class in Britain. It was as many as 30% of potential recruits that were being turned in then into 1900, 1901, 1902. So this is sort of saying that these men are from sort of still working class or middle class backgrounds who are physically fit and a sort of class above the masses, if you would use that phrase. You also see some of the localised elements there with local JPs being involved, and that again sees this incredibly local approach rather than men having to go to Belfast and so on. The more observant of you will see that there's a discrepancy in the figure given here, where we have 120 members of the 3rd Battalion, and the figure that I show on the map later on, I think it's about 108. And I think that's to do with the medical rejections. I think that's why you have the difference between are quite a confusing one, because it seems a fair number of volunteers from Carrickfergus had gone to Belfast to enlist the big UVF rallies there, and of course then is now a very straightforward and cheap railway journey from Carrickfergus to Belfast, so that was a fairly common practice, it seems. If I could turn to our next slide, please, where we look at a speech by John Redmond, the Irish Parliamentary Party leader. Thanks. This is an extract from the Freeman's Journal, 17th of September 1914, and it's reporting a speech that's part of a series of speeches. The more famous one is given on the 20th of September, where Redmond speaks at Woodenbridge in County Wicklow. and a number of books, including some textbooks, it has to be said, suggest that Woodenbridge on the 20th of September is this sort of massive sea change in Irish sort of constitutional nationalist thought about the war. If you've ever been to Woodenbridge, it's a very small place. There's a hotel, there's a golf club, there's also a petrol station, and a few houses. It's not a town, it's not even really a village. So some of these works will talk about Redmond. You arrive by car, seeing a group of local volunteers drilling, and then stopping and giving a speech. And the Woodenbridge speech is where Redmond encourages the men to serve wherever the firing line extends. They should enlist in the British Army and serve in Europe. But that is portrayed as a very spontaneous act. It was clearly a carefully staged one. You don't get 500, 600 volunteers together in Woodenbridge without quite a bit of prior organisation. And the speech then shows you some of the groundwork that had been laid for the Woodenbridge speech and for others. On the outbreak of war, Redmond, as Irish Parliamentary Party leader, had made it clear that they would support the British war effort. That's important because during the South African War, the Irish Party had been opposed to the British war effort. So there's an important difference to mention there. Initially, what Redmond was talking about was that the Irish National Volunteers would serve as a home defence force. We'll see a little more of this in our next slide too. And it's only then as you go into September with this settlement about the Home Rule Bill that you start to get the call for men to enlist in the British Army. It should be said that the call that goes out from the Irish Party is not as loud and is not as profound as the call that goes out from the Irish Unionist Party. So the Carrickfergus event that I've looked at is quite a sort of small scale, localised one. There are a number of these, particularly in Belfast, where Edward Carson addresses Ulster volunteers and says a number of interesting things. Well, one is that the deal that he's got from the British government is not one that he's entirely happy with, but he says that Ulster volunteers must put the Empire first, and that their proper place at this stage is in the British Army. Now, Carson, as a convinced unionist, as a patriot, whatever other phrase we want to use, that's a fairly normal thing to say, to join the British Army in the sort of British Empire's time of crisis. For John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party, it's a more difficult ask that they have of their followers. So what you're getting in this piece here is John Redmond sort of justifying the Irish Party's decision to back the British war effort with limited pieces about the British war effort itself. So we get a lot here about the defence and liberties of small nations. Belgium's mentioned, Poland's mentioned. So we have a number of things that go on there. Then when we have the suggestion that Irishmen should serve in the British Army, the phrase British Army isn't really used. Instead, we have the term of the Irish Brigade being used, and what that translates to is the 16th Irish Division, and particularly the 47th Brigade of the 16th Irish Division, which draws very heavily on Irish National Volunteer recruits. So, for example, the 6th Connaught Rangers draws the bulk of its manpower from the Irish National Volunteers of West Belfast, a very high participation rate from those volunteers from West Belfast into the British Army. The arrangements that Redmond gets with the British Army are not really as good as those that the Irish Unionists are able to get. So where we have somebody like Mclaughlin, who is former British Army officer who's then trusted to command a battalion, Sorry, I lost everyone for a moment there, did I?
Tim, you're back now.
I'm back now. Sorry, where had I got to? Can you
Literally a
have
couple
I
of
been out
seconds.
for 5 minutes?
No, a couple
A
of
couple of
seconds.
seconds. Good, good. I haven't been screaming into the void for too long.
No.
I think what I was saying was that the arrangements and the deal that John Redmond had got with the British government, particularly the War Office, for the 16th Irish Division are not as good as those that the Ulster Volunteers had managed to get to the 36th Ulster Division. So you get a number of officers appointed to the Ulster Division who are convinced unionists, members of the UVF, relatively senior officers. For the 16th Irish Division, that's much more problematic, partly because Catholic Ireland didn't have a great tradition of men joining the British Army as officers in the first place. So, John Redmond's brother, William Redmond, ends up commissioned in as a captain. Sorry, I'm slipping in and out. I'll move on and talk about the next source if I could, which is to do with the anti-recruitment leaflet. No, people have lost me altogether, have they?
I think, Tim, you're sort of dropping in and out a bit.
Yeah, sorry about this.
No.
Let's see if I can. No, I'm hopefully back with people now.
I can hear you now, Tim. Hear you now.
Great, super. Sorry, we're having one of those days. Yes, what I've been saying there was simply that the arrangements that the John Redmond, the Irish Party, get over the 16th Irish Division are not really as generous as those that the Ulster Volunteers get with the 36th Ulster Division. So there is a sort of problem in quality of service there, which I think the next source leads us on to quite neatly. Can you put up the next slide for us, please, Glynn?
It's there, Tim.
It's there. I can't see the screen now. So we're having great fun anyway. I have it printed out in front of me. So this is the text of an anti-recruitment leaflet, which is supposedly circulated in Dublin in October 1914. The problem with a lot of these anti-recruitment leaflets is you're not really sure what the provenance of them is and what sort of numbers of them are ever printed. So you're not really sure if this is something that's put together by an organised group, if it's Sinn Féin, Irish Citizens Army, something of that nature, or if it's simply an individual who has managed to put something together. This then shows you some of the problems that Redmond is dealing with within nationalism. And while Redmond tries to hold the Irish National Volunteer movement together, you do, of course, get a split within it. And this is really something that focuses on this. So if you're thinking of sort of crude numbers, the Irish National Volunteers in the summer of 1914 are deemed to be about 180,000 strong. It's thought that something like 32,000 of
Glenn, I think we have lost him again for a second or two. We'll give it another second or two and see if he manages to come back in.
I'm back now, I think. Sorry,
Yes.
that's really badly today. So I was talking about the anti-recruitment leaflet, and this sort of shows you the problems of the split within Irish nationalism. It comes quite early in the war, and in retrospect, you can see this as the first real problem for the Irish Party and for John Redmond's leadership of it, that it's thought the Irish National Volunteers are about Sorry, I was just muted there for a moment too. This is really playing up oddly today. So what I was saying is that this leaflet is an important one in showing you the splits within Irish nationalism. Irish National Volunteers about 180,000 strong in the summer of 1914. Ultimately, about 10,000 of those split away and reject Redmond's leadership, so adopt this sort of anti-war policy approach. And then of that 10,000, about 1,200 of them are the core of the volunteers that serve in the Easter Rising. So in retrospect, then you can see this as a major fracture, and this sort of highlights a lot of the problems that Redmond faces. That the Irish National Volunteers are formed supposedly to support the Home Rule Party. Then Redmond talks about them being used to defend Ireland, but then all the questions here about who's Ireland being defended against and why. And then we have the problems about national volunteers with English officers, a real sort of jibe there about how things are being organised in the 16th Irish Division, where Lawrence Parsons, who's appointed to command it, is a pretty convinced unionist, so that creates a number of problems. This means that Redmond is facing problems from quite early on with his recruitment policy, and whereas Carson sort of faces this fairly head on in what he says to Ulster volunteers, Irish National Volunteers are told rather different things. So when Joe Devlin in West Belfast is recruiting them, he basically says that Home Rule is not an established fact, and that this has been granted by the democracy of Great Britain, and then Irish National Volunteers should support Great Britain because of that. That then means, of course, the unionist press to say, well, actually Home Rule hasn't been passed, this is open to negotiation again. So this starts to show you some of the real problems within the nationalist movement as we go into the First World War, and that sort of, if we're thinking about the decline of the Irish Parliamentary Party and Redmond's authority over it, this we can see as a very early start to that. If we could come to the next and last slide there, please, Glynn.
That's it up.
That's us, super. So you'll see here, this is a map that's been put together. You can hopefully make out some bits and pieces of it. And you'll see that the little squares are numbers that are Ulster volunteers that are enlisting, and the circles are Irish National Volunteers. So to cut it short, the Irish National Volunteer formed enlistment is only really seen in West Belfast, in Derry City, and in Enniskillen. And that's it in the whole of Ireland. It's not that there's lots of Irish National formed volunteering elsewhere. Having said all that, it's thought that individually you get something like 32,000 Irish National Volunteers that enlist, which is broadly similar to the Ulster Volunteer Force figures, again thought to be about 30,000. So that gives you an idea of some of the local figures that are thrown up. The other thing to say, of course, is that recruitment in Derry City is quite an interesting one, because you actually have more Irish National Volunteer recruitment there than Ulster Volunteer recruitment, and also in large chunks of rural Ulster, UVF recruitment is fairly sparse. So actually, if you're thinking about these Irish National Volunteers that enlist from West Belfast, that's a very high participation rate from any population anywhere in Ireland. So that's just worth flagging up. And the final bit, just to put up the cover of the book, they're available from Libraries NI, or indeed direct from the publishers, Liverpool University Press. So just a little plug for that, which was a very interesting book I thought to work on, and I spent many happy hours in PRONI in better days working through a number of these collections, particularly Henry Mclaughlin's papers, which are a particularly useful resource there. He was the chair of the Central Recruiting Committee for Ireland.